Good evening. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's program. Please stay tuned to the end of today's program for a brief summary of some upcoming programs that I know you won't want to miss. And please consider becoming a member of the World Affairs Council Town Hall. You can check out all the benefits on our website at lawacth.org. For those of you who would like to ask Dan questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which starts in about 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dan Schnur and Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, his wonderful weekly program that we all depend on. Hey, Dan, how you doing?
Hey, Kim, how are you?
Oh, the news gets busier and busier. Maybe we need to do longer times with you every week. There's so much to unbake.
Well, we'll get through as much of it as we can in an hour. And of course, as many of our group knows, that although we don't do it this week every other hour, or excuse me, every other week, we do an extra 30 minutes for World Affairs Council Town Hall members. And so that's 90 minutes, and that's still not enough.
Well, let's get to your two topics tonight, Dan. It's a lot to cover. First, is there really good reason, really good news, in the Middle East? And secondly, how the Virginia governor's race will impact Biden's presidency. Let's go, Dan. Can't wait. Take care.
Well, thanks so much, Kim. And thanks so much to all of you for joining us for these weekly conversations. And I will tell you, at the conclusion of last week's webinar, some of you may remember that the final question that came in is one of you sent a question to Jessica. Can you ask Dan if there's ever anything to be optimistic about? And what I realized is way back when we started these webinars, back in the spring of 2020, in the beginning stages of the coronavirus shutdown, we did make some effort to try to provide some positive, some optimistic news in the face of all the challenges we were talking about each week. And such is the nature of news that we tend to focus on challenges that haven't yet been resolved. But it did occur to me when that question came in last week that there is encouraging news that comes out on a fairly regular basis. And so our first topic today is to talk about an issue where I think there has been some positive progress taking place in recent weeks. And believe it or not, that's in the Middle East. Now, over the years, over the decades, those of us who follow the geopolitics in that part of the world have learned not to be very optimistic. Israel has been at war with at least some of its neighbors for all practical purposes ever since its inception in 1948. And this year's conflict with Hamas in the Gaza Strip and the huge unresolved differences in how to effectively address the continuing security challenges in the West Bank, not to mention the vows of Iran's leaders and their clients to destroy Israel altogether, make peace seem as far away as ever. But I am going to offer you some positive potential progress being made there. But before I do, I'm going to ask Claire to post the first question just to get a baseline for our own thinking on the Middle East. And so, question for all of you to consider: do you think peace between Israel and the Palestinians is possible? Option one, yes, it is possible, and it's something that could happen within the next 5 years. It's one option. The second option is yes, but it's longer term, probably 10 years or more. Option three, no, not for the foreseeable future, maybe someday, but nothing we can see in the current construct. And fourth, never. There's just not going to be peace in that part of the world. That's just all there is to it. So just as a baseline for our discussion going forward, where's everybody's head? Where's everybody's mood on this one? Very interesting. 62%, almost 2/3 of you, say not for the foreseeable future, which at least in this construct means more than 10 years. And if you add in the 5% that say there will never be peace in that part of the world, we've got almost precisely 2/3 that are very decidedly pessimistic about the potential for progress there. Only 9% see the potential for peace in the next 5 years. And a quarter of you say, well, maybe not quite that short, but possibly within 5 to 10 years. So all in all, pretty gloomy outlook. And you could make a case that that's somewhat justified given the challenges, given the problems that we've seen in the Middle East over many, many years. But let's talk about some potential progress here if we can. Now, last year, as most of you remember, when Israel forged working agreements to normalize relationships with 4 Middle Eastern Arab states, there was widespread praise. But even the historic nature of the cooperation between Israel and Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and the United Arab Emirates received a less enthusiastic response in this country than was probably deserved. And that's most likely because of the wide political divide between the Trump administration and most American Jews. But as the months have passed, the Abraham Accords, as they're known, have laid the groundwork for increasingly strong economic and societal ties between Israel and these other countries. Now, for decades, the conventional wisdom in the Middle East and in the US and elsewhere presumed that relationships between Israel and the Muslim world could not improve until the Palestinian issues had been fully resolved. But these treaties are demonstrating that peace between the Israelis and Palestinians, while certainly not immediate, as most of you correctly identified, these treaties are demonstrating that peace between Israel and the Palestinians could potentially come as a result of the improved climate in the region rather than the condition for it. In other words, maybe relationships between Israel and other Middle Eastern countries can improve to move the peace process forward, rather than the peace process needing to be completed before those relationships can improve. Now, that peace, as most of you correctly identified, is realistically still a long, long way off. But we've already seen just in the last year some very, very enhanced trade and tourism activity between Israel and these other countries. And just in the last several days, there are other potentially impactful steps forward that have begun to come into view. Now, the most interesting, the most intriguing of those steps is the possibility that Saudi Arabia, really the regional behemoth in that part of the world, there's a real possibility, it's now being reported, that Saudi Arabia might be considering a US offer to join the Abraham Accords and to normalize relations officially with Israel. Now, just earlier this month, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan brought up this subject when he met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And reportedly, Sullivan received a cautious but largely positive response from the prince. Now, let's be real. The United States and Saudi Arabia still have a lot of serious differences of their own that have to be resolved. But let's also agree that any steps that the Saudis take toward better relationships with Israel could lead to similar progress with many other countries in the region, given their influence in that part of the world. So before we go any further, let's again stop. I'd like to ask you for an assessment. So the Abraham Accords between Israel and these 4 Muslim countries, and possibly Saudi Arabia and others as well, how important do you think are the Abraham Accords as a step toward peace in the Middle East? So 5 options here. Number 1, the Accords are a major step toward peace. Number 2, the Accords are a small step toward peace. Third, the Accords will have a big impact, but they still won't affect the core problem. So it might help with trade, it might help with tourism, but that's not going to address the fundamental differences in that part of the world. Fourth, the Accords aren't going to have much of an effect one way or another on the peace process. And fifth and finally, the Accords will actually make peace less likely. So we have a full range of options here. So what do you all have to say? What do all of you think on this one? Look at that. We have just about 3/4 of our group who thinks that either the Accords will have only a small step toward peace, but it'll help in a lot of other ways, but don't really affect the core problems. So we think this will help one way or another, but not an immense deal. 15% of you are much more optimistic that think this represents a major step toward peace, and less than 10% say no impact or less likely. But this is interesting because it demonstrates to me that most of us do believe that these Accords can move things in the right direction. But it is only a first step. And while it is a positive step, it is only a first one. And I think that's a sound assessment. Now, on other fronts, it's also been reported that Israel and United Arab Emirates are planning a joint space mission in which the two countries would fly a joint mission to the moon, and they would together plant their respective national flags on the moon by 2024, in less than 3 years. And that mission would also include the launching of a satellite that the two countries would operate together and then use for a series of collaborative research projects. And this to me suggests a much longer term partnership between the two countries, because this is something that would manifest itself for many, many years to come. On another front of less substantive policy importance, but representing immense symbolic value, is the prospect of Israel teaming up with other countries in the region to host a future World Cup soccer championship. And I know that sounds sort of ridiculous, but bear with me for a second and I'll let you know what's been reported on this. So some of you may know, if you are followers of soccer or football, you know that a combined bid from the United States and Canada and Mexico was awarded the 2026 World Cup. And it's the first time that 3 countries have ever combined to host the Cup together. But that's now created a precedent that led the president of FIFA, and FIFA, of course, is the international governing body of soccer or international football. The president of FIFA has now suggested that Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and other Middle Eastern countries could collectively host the 2030 World Cup with games played throughout the Middle East. Now look, the likelihood of a Middle Eastern World Cup that includes Israel is small. But the fact that the suggestion from a responsible party was not immediately dismissed or ridiculed is noteworthy. And I'd argue that it's encouraging, because soccer fans are not only the most passionate enthusiasts for their favorite teams in sports, but their passions often spring from nationalist and ethnic roots. And so that the idea of a joint effort along these lines is even faintly plausible means that the street passions that Middle Eastern leaders often use to avoid forward progress might not be quite as insurmountable an obstacle as we often assume. Now, the biggest remaining obstacle, even with these measured steps forward, the biggest remaining obstacle, which we barely mentioned today, is Iran. Now, we're overdue for setting aside some time in a webinar for a discussion about the state of the nuclear arms negotiations with that country's leadership. And so we'll try to do that in the next few weeks. But in addition to the tension between the United States and Iran, and of course between Iran and Israel, beyond those direct tensions is the effect that the growing aggressiveness of the Iranian leadership is having on many of the Sunni nations in the region. Now, this is nothing new. This Shiite-Sunni clash has been going on for centuries. And if you look at the dynamic between Iran and Saudi Arabia and their respective allies, it's been operating at a fever pitch in the Middle East for quite some time. But in recent years, many of those countries with majority Sunni populations, led by Saudi Arabia, have become so distrustful of Iran that they've begun to develop ties with Israel in a way that would have been unimaginable.
Todd Young from Indiana, who's on the Foreign Relations Committee.
Not sure what we're hearing in the back there. In any case, okay. Well, anyway, what we're seeing is some of the Sunni countries, led by Saudi Arabia, that are so distrustful of Iran, they've been establishing unofficial relationships, but relationships nonetheless with Israel in a way that would have just not been possible or even imaginable 15, 20 years ago. Now, many smart analysts have pointed out that the Abraham Accords only formalize the unofficial and quiet relationships between these countries and Israel that already exist. And even though Saudi Arabia has not yet signed on to the Abraham Accords, the under-the-radar cooperation between the Saudis and Israelis has been increasing markedly in recent years. So when the Abraham Accords were signed last year, some believed it made an Israel-Palestinian agreement unnecessary. In other words, if Israel and these Muslim countries can come to an agreement, why continue to fight about the Israeli-Palestinian relationship? But Saudi Arabia's King Salman has continued to make it very clear and very insistently that an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians is of great importance. And most Arab leaders do feel the same way. But as these other developments, these other relationships continue to move forward, the urgency of a political deal between Israel and the Palestinians isn't nearly as great. And already we're seeing how the new Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, is using this maneuvering space to promote economic and human rights advancements for the Palestinians, even while still avoiding conversations about statehood. Now, the internal politics of Israel is another topic that we'll need to return to in a future webinar before too long. And as I said earlier, peace in the Middle East is still a long way off, and I know most of you agree with me on that. But each of these agreements, the Abraham Accords, the space mission, the World Cup, and Bennett's efforts, they represent a small step forward, small steps forward. But taken together, it does become somewhat easier to see a path forward to a better future between Israel and its neighbors and throughout the Middle East. But there is a long way to go before we get there. And even though these first steps are encouraging, there's a lot more that needs to be done. So the final question we'd like to ask you on this topic before we move on is, who do you think has the most responsibility for ending the violence? Who's in the best position to continue to move this process forward? Is it Israel? Is it the Palestinians? Is it other Arab or Muslim countries? Is it the US and Europe playing the role of peacemaker? Or is it China and Russia playing a different type of role than they have in the past? Who do you think has the greatest ability to move this process forward in a productive way? 52% of you, a little bit more than half, say Israel, and that's not surprising, but it's instructive. Another 45% point to the Palestinians and other Arab or Muslim countries. But most interesting to me about these results is only 3% of our group sees the impetus for that change coming from outside the region. And whether it's the US, whether it's Europe, whether it's China, or it's Russia, what I'm hearing loud and clear from all of you is this is something that needs to be resolved by Israel and its neighbors. And outside involvement isn't going to make much of a difference. And I suspect that's probably right. Let's move on, though. Let's move on to our second topic before we go to your questions, which we'll do in about 10 minutes or so when we get to the bottom of the hour. And the second topic is why the governor's race in the state of Virginia, in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Why does the Virginia governor's race matter so much? It's 1 out of 50 states, but it's only one of 2 states that holds their elections for governor in the year after a presidential election. And New Jersey, which is an even deeper blue state than Virginia, will be electing their next governor, a week from today. But the Virginia governor's race between the former governor and longtime Democratic fundraiser Terry McAuliffe and the wealthy Republican businessman Glenn Youngkin is locked in a dead heat in most opinion polls. And no single election, not in Virginia and not in California and not in Iowa or New Hampshire, no single election ever answers all the questions of the moment in politics. But the Virginia governor's race has taken on such outsized importance, particularly to nervous Democrats who are becoming somewhat fearful about losing their congressional majorities in next year's midterm elections. And they're looking to this New Jersey governor's race for signs as to how concerned they should be. Now, the outcome of this race isn't going to provide any definite guidance for next year, but it could begin to answer some of the questions about the current state of the electorate, not just in Virginia, but nationally, and some of the questions that will shape the races next year in a national set of midterm elections. The most important of those questions, not surprisingly, is the role of former President Donald Trump as a motivator. And the question is whether Trump is a motivator for Republicans or for Democrats. Who does he motivate more? And how does his presence, if not on the ballot, on the political landscape, affect who is inspired to vote in the two parties and who doesn't bother? Now, McAuliffe is doing everything he can to make this race about Trump. He and his team are worried that Republicans are more enthusiastic about voting in next week's election than Democrats, and the polls bear that out. They're concerned, they're afraid that the Virginia voters who delivered very large victories for the Democrats in the 2018 midterms and the 2020 presidential election seem to see Trump as less of a threat today than when he was in office, and therefore they might be less motivated to turn out in a gubernatorial race. Now, I know what you're thinking, at least those of you from California. You're thinking that was exactly the same challenge that Gavin Newsom faced out here during the recent recall election, when the Democratic voters didn't seem as motivated as Republicans. And then Newsom was able to successfully link talk show host Larry Elder to Trump. And by using Elder as a stand-in, if you will, for Trump, he used that to motivate an otherwise unenthusiastic Democratic base and was able to beat back the recall via very large margin. But California is a lot more heavily Democratic than Virginia. And Youngkin isn't as combative as Elder, and he's not nearly as willing to associate himself with Trump as Elder was. But the more successful McAuliffe is in making the Virginia race as much about Trump as about Youngkin, the more likely he is to win. McAuliffe is to win. Now, nearly as important in next week's election, nearly as important as the Trump factor, is the Biden factor. Because the declining popularity, as we discussed last week, the declining popularity of the current president appears to be playing a role in keeping the Virginia race as close as it is, in pretty much according to the polls of a dead heat. And Biden's standing will be even more important in determining how well or how badly Democrats do next year. Now, as we talked about last week, Biden's approval ratings began to fall after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And the Virginia race started tightening at almost exactly the same time. The absence of action on Biden's major domestic policy initiatives has also gotten Democrats a lot more frustrated. And this campaign is because this campaign is so close, that's been one of the driving forces behind the renewed efforts we've seen over the last several days of Biden and congressional Democrats to come together on his legislative package, because they believe if they can strike a deal by next Tuesday, that could really help the Democrats. That could really help McAuliffe in Virginia. Now, the Virginia governor's race also is giving us some insight into what issues will be most important in next year's election. Now, Trump, as has been the case for a while now, Trump is pretty much of a surrogate for the debate over COVID, especially questions relating to mask and especially vaccine mandates. McAuliffe is also trying to use the abortion issue to attract younger and female votes. Youngkin, the Republican, is doing the same with crime and immigration to win over suburban voters and older voters. But the two issues that are dominating in Virginia more than any other are the issues of the economy and education. And while this is a statewide campaign taking place in 1 out of the 50 states, now seems like a pretty good time, given the issues that are being discussed in Virginia, for us to revisit what are the issues that are most important to us, wherever we live in the country. So these are the issues that are dominating the Virginia governor's race. Which one is the most important to you right now? Is it COVID and mask and vaccine mandates? Is it economic inequality, the context in which McAuliffe and most Democrats are talking about economic issues? Is it inflation? That's the framework that most Republicans are putting on the economic debate. Is it abortion rights? Or is it education policy? Which of these issues matters most to you? Yeah. So these numbers are switching. We ask this question to you pretty regularly, and we're beginning to see questions relating to the economy, economic inequality and inflation combined add up to more than half of our sample. We're seeing those economic indicators rise up whenever we ask the question. You may remember that the last time we asked you this, COVID and the economy were relatively even. Well, now we're seeing people, even though we're obviously still concerned about the pandemic and still hopefully taking appropriate precautions, all of us, when it comes to political decision-making, the economy is really beginning to assert itself. Abortion and education, which are critically important issues to some voters, don't seem to rank quite as highly here. But it's the education issue in particular that's made the governor's race in Virginia so close. Because what's happened there is Terry McAuliffe gave Youngkin an opening to make education a prime issue, because they've been arguing about education back and forth. And McAuliffe in a recent debate said, quote, "I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach," unquote. And this was in the context of a discussion about how to teach race relations and civil rights in public schools. They've had a debate in Virginia about potentially sexually suggestive reading that some parents think is inappropriate for children of different ages. So in the context of this argument, McAuliffe says, I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach. And Youngkin jumped on this. And he used what McAuliffe said to piggyback onto what's becoming a growing and divisive cultural debate, one that's generated anger and protests at local school board meetings around the country, and one that, just as we're seeing now in the Virginia governor's race, I would predict to you is an issue we're going to see in a pretty pronounced way emerge in the 2022 midterm elections. And even though education is primarily an issue over the years that Democrats have benefited, on which Democrats have benefited, depending on how this governor's race in Virginia turns out, it could be an issue that other Republicans use, taking a cue from Youngkin, to argue in favor of parental involvement in public schools, an issue that allows them to reach out to swing voters in a way that they're less able to do on COVID, on abortion, and other traditionally reliable Democratic issues. The education debate touches on everything from curriculum issues, the teaching of history and or teaching racial history, to COVID-related school shutdowns and divisions over mask and vaccine mandates in schools. So this issue doesn't rank all that high on our list yet, but depending on how next Tuesday goes, and the fact that the race is this close is already some indicator that we're going to hear a lot more conversation nationally about education policy next year than we have in quite some time. So let's stop here and ask you another question as it relates to education. If we can, Claire, who do you think should have the biggest say in what's taught in public schools? Should teachers be the primary drivers on those decisions? Should it be principals and other school administrators? should parents be making those decisions? Maybe not unilaterally, but having a larger voice than is currently the case. How about school boards and other elected officials? Or finally, should state and federal elected officials be making these decisions? Let's agree that in some way, all 5 of these groups should have some voice in the discussion. But who do you think should have the biggest say? Let's see what our group has to say. Very interesting. Only 7% of our group, which we do know tends to lean a little bit leftward, think parents should have the final say. And that is going to become a partisan flashpoint over the next year in the national midterm elections. But when you move past that number, which sort of stands out, what we also see is that state and federal elected officials, our group tends to think, shouldn't have much of a role. But all of the other groups, teachers, principals and school administrators, school boards, local elected officials, all should have a voice. But as the debate moves forward, not just in Virginia over the next week, but nationwide over the next year, expect this question and questions like it to get a huge amount of attention. Now, there's a lot more that can be said about the Virginia governor's race and what it means on the national landscape, particularly given the way McAuliffe has attempted to distance himself from national Democrats. Although Joe Biden is campaigning for him today, generally speaking, McAuliffe has actually been very critical of the Democrats in Washington from not passing Biden's legislative package. And Youngkin has attempted to pull off a very delicate dance while not renouncing Donald Trump, keeping his distance from him and refusing to campaign with Trump. So we're watching both candidates in Virginia trying to avoid the national parties at a time when both national parties and their leaders aren't all that particular. Although this election will be over a week from tonight, and I imagine we'll talk about it going forward, not just for what it means for the Commonwealth of Virginia, but what it tells us about next year's midterm elections. And of course, that's a topic we'll talk about a number of times between now and next November. So with that, let's bring Jessica out to join us. Jessica, welcome back. I know you had a very lovely trip home over the course of the week, so we're happy to have you back here safely. How are our questions looking?
We're looking good. We've got a lot of really interesting questions on the Middle East, so I'm excited to jump right into those. The first question, 40 different Kurdish groups announced Tuesday that they would all meet for a major summit in September, which will be held in the Iraqi city of Erbil. Will governments in the Middle East ever truly recognize the Kurds and give them a state?
Just like we look for positive signs toward progress in Israel, I think we can look for signs also, like this conference, toward progress for the Kurds. But like the challenges in Israel, the challenges for a standalone Kurdish state are considerable. And while it may happen someday, it's not going to happen in the near to medium future. There are too many players in and near the Middle East who have reasons to oppose an independent Kurdish state. But it doesn't make it impossible. It means it is going to be a long road to hoe. To me, though, Jessica, the most interesting thing about this conference is it's being hosted by Iraq. And we talked about this right after the fall of Afghanistan earlier this fall, and the noted contrast between the way the United States left Afghanistan and left Iraq. When the US pulled out of Afghanistan, we left quickly, and our entire military presence left very quickly as well. In Iraq, you may remember this from previous conversations, we left behind a very small troop contingent, about 2,500 US servicemen and servicewomen. And what we've seen is that small number of troops has been enough to assist the existing Iraqi government in continuing to maintain some stability and also beginning to play some outreach roles throughout the Middle East, as this conference demonstrates. In retrospect, it's worth wondering, as much as most Americans wanted to leave Afghanistan behind after 20 difficult years, if even a small troop presence there might have been able to have a similar effect in Afghanistan as our presence in Iraq has had, not only allowing the country itself to stay stable, but allowing it to begin to engage in these regional efforts. So there's a long way to go, but it's very encouraging that this conference is taking place. And the Iraqi leadership deserves tremendous credit for marshaling the forces for, once again, even if they're just first steps in the right direction.
Thank you. This next questioner says, good news in the Middle East requires more than Israel and Hamas. Saudi Arabia will be ruled by an amoral autocrat, MBS. Afghanistan is ruled by an intolerant cult, the Taliban. Egypt is ruled by an authoritarian general who ignores human rights. Sudan and Ethiopia are even worse. And then he also includes several other Middle Eastern nations. How can you see any good news in that region?
Okay. So I talked about positive first steps, and I'm not going to deny for a moment that the challenges in the Middle East are tremendous. But I think if you can find a situation where Israel, instead of being at war or proximate to war with most of the Muslim world, is in the process of developing economic and cultural ties, that is progress. I think in order for Saudi Arabia, in order for Egypt and other Middle Eastern countries with human rights problems to move further into the world of nations, those problems aren't going to go away. Those human rights abuses aren't going to go away anytime soon. But they recognize, in order to have a multinational effort working with them to forestall Iran from future aggressive behavior, that requires some compromise on their part also. Now, the Trump administration didn't ask very much of either Saudi Arabia or Egypt in this regard. The Biden administration, it seems to me, is gradually ramping up its efforts to raise these questions. It's a slow process, it's a careful process, it's going to be a very, very long-term process. But when I introduced the first subject, it was not to say, hey, look at how great things are in the Middle East, but rather to say, look at positive steps when Israel and some of its neighbors can begin engaging in a more productive way. And while that doesn't immediately solve the other tremendous concerns that the questioner rightly raised, it represents important first steps to get to a point where those challenges can be addressed in a way that they haven't been for many, many years, because the region has been so preoccupied on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. These other controversies, these other problems have been allowed to fester without a lot of time and attention because of the amount of time and energy spent on Israel and the Palestinians. If progress begins to be made there, that creates an opportunity to address some of these other issues in a way that hasn't been the case. Is that great news? No. Is it an overall solution? Is it a time for celebration? No. But I would argue that it does represent positive steps in the right direction. And the way you take bigger steps in the right direction is to start with small steps.
The leaders who negotiated these treaties are considered despots by many, including Netanyahu. It's been widely reported that the Abraham Accords were more of an arms deal versus a peace deal between Israel and these Middle Eastern countries. Israel and the UAE were also doing business behind the scenes before they normalized relations. These countries have terrible human rights violations as well. Isn't it more about Iran and, of course, money?
Well, as I said during the presentation, to a large degree, it is about Iran. It's concerns about Iran and its fears about Iran that are driving some of Israel's longtime enemies to find ways to work together. The questioner is right about this being a formalization of existing outreach efforts between these countries. And that's something that I mentioned earlier also. Israel and Saudi Arabia, Israel and the UAE, Israel and several of the other Gulf states have had quieter, more informal relationships growing for some time now, including intelligence sharing as it relates to a potential threat, as it relates to a very real threat from Iran. But I wouldn't underestimate the importance of informal, quiet, behind-the-scenes efforts becoming formal, louder, more public agreements. That represents a growing comfort level in these types of cooperative efforts. And that in turn allows for more cooperative work to be done going forward. The questioner raises the point that these agreements also involve military arms. Well, I would say that that is probably, for better or worse, sort of standard in the world today, not just in the Middle East, but in the West, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and the US relationships with its allies all over the world. Part of maintaining diplomatic and economic and security ties has been the sale of arms from those countries that produce them to those that don't. And so while in a better world, no country would need military arms at all, and these agreements could take place solely on a diplomatic or economic basis, I think it's worth noting that holding these Middle Eastern countries to a different standard and minimizing the impact of economic and cultural advancements because there are military sales involved is holding these Middle Eastern countries to a different standard than we hold countries in the West, the US included.
What role do you think Turkey can and should play in the Middle East as they move toward more normal international relationships?
I think Turkey has the potential to be a critically important player in the Middle East. And unfortunately, for many years now, it has played a much less positive and much more unhelpful role. Some of that is the West's responsibility. There was a time when Turkey wanted to integrate much more closely with Europe, and the European Union was very, very cool to the idea. Erdogan and Turkey's other leaders took that pushback as license to look for allies and opportunities in other places. And for some time now, they have been, for lack of a better, they have been very much of an agitating force in the Middle East. I believe that's more of a reflection of current geopolitics than a necessary ongoing state. And I do think, while again, just like the other issues we've talked about are not going to come with short-term solutions, I think a medium to long-term effort can make Turkey a much more productive player in the Middle East than it has been. Ironically, just to point out how closely tied these issues are together, the first question that you raised, Jessica, if I'm not mistaken, was about the conference that the Iraqis held about a nation for the Kurds. Now, the Turks are vehemently opposed to that, of course, because they worry that an independent Kurdish nation on Turkey's borders would represent a seminal threat to Turkey and its people. So it's not going to be easy, but I do believe that with the right long-term diplomatic efforts, that Turkey can become a more constructive force in this part of the world than it has been for some time.
What is the most pressing issue in the Middle East with respect to the national security of the United States?
It's the most pressing national security in the Middle East as it relates to the United States.
Well, that's the most pressing issue in the Middle East.
Most pressing issue in the Middle East as it relates for the United States, it's certainly Iran, no question about it. And we will come back and talk about this in a future webinar. But since we last revisited the nuclear arms negotiations, I would tell you that they've gotten worse, but that would assume that there were negotiations taking place. And what's become clear over the last several months is the Iranian leadership has much less interest in re-engaging the negotiations at all, which continues to buy them time to move further and further toward nuclear capability. And while the Biden administration originally wanted to re-implement the nuclear arms agreement that the Obama administration had led with a number of countries in dealings with Iran, it's now starting to look less likely that that agreement is going to be rebuilt. Biden and his negotiators have made it clear how much they'd like it to, but the Iranians have been so off-putting, it's harder and harder to justify. So if those negotiations don't continue and Iran continues to move further toward nuclear capacity, it's hard to think of another issue as pressing to the US interests as a nuclear capable Iran.
Thank you. Moving to the Virginia race, do you think Obama showing up for McAuliffe at a rally will help or hurt his chances?
I think the primary reason for having Biden or Obama campaign with McAuliffe is to motivate the Democratic base to turn out. And if you think about it, this is a conversation we had not just during the recall election earlier this fall, it's a conversation we had last year during the presidential election. Because when it comes right down to it, McAuliffe, like Biden, is somewhat of a centrist, somewhat establishment politician, not the type of Democrat who motivates the youngest and more progressive voters in that party's base. And the thought is a president or former president of the United States coming into campaign for McAuliffe can help increase motivation to turn out Democrats on election day. And in a race that's this close, in which it does appear that Republicans have enough of a motivational edge in a blue state like Virginia to have the race pretty much tied, turning out unenthusiastic Democrats on election day is by far McAuliffe's greatest task at this point. And even Obama and Biden, who are not necessarily beloved by the party base, given their current or former office, do provide a motivational impact that can be a real help to McAuliffe. So no question, it helps him. It certainly helps him.
What influence will the controversy over teaching critical race theory have in the Virginia governor's race?
Well, I didn't talk a lot about critical race theory, but you did hear me talk about education. And as I alluded to, without using that particular phrase, it was an argument going on in the state of Virginia about how to teach the history of race relations and how to teach the history of civil rights in this country that helped lay the groundwork for the broader education debate about parental involvement and in curriculum decision making. So the critical race theory discussion might not be in the headlines every day, but it's the foundation that's led to the impact of the education issue and has allowed Youngkin to climb back into the race from a fairly disadvantaged position over the summer to a much more competitive position now. Our group didn't seem to think, when we polled, that parents should be the strongest voice in the discussion. And I don't know if Virginia voters think that or not, but it's very clear that a lot of Virginia voters, particularly swing voters, particularly voters in the center of the political spectrum, whether they think parents should be the most important voice in the education discussion, believe they should have a greater voice in the education discussion. And McAuliffe's gaffe and Youngkin's leverage on that issue has made this race as close as it is, but it all came from a discussion about how to teach race and civil rights in a public school curriculum. So the questioner has it nailed. This is the basis for the discussion they're now having.
Thank you. Another question on education. Why are, I think it's Loudoun County Public Schools requiring parents to sign an NDA style form to review their curriculum? Shouldn't that be public and support transparency between schools and parents?
Okay, so Loudoun County is in Northern Virginia, not that far out of Washington, D.C., and it's been one of the flashpoints for this discussion of curriculum. And it's become so sensitive and such a nasty debate in a lot of ways that the county decided that asking parents to sign a non-disclosure agreement was the best way to keep the debate from aging out of control. And of course, as the questioner correctly suggested, it's had the exact opposite effect. That when you require parents to sign a non-disclosure agreement on something relating to a child's education, even if the goal is to keep the conversation from getting too heated and too combative, it tends to breed a great deal of resentment. And so parents on both sides of this debate felt like the county officials were muzzling them and became even more resentful. And it's real quick before we move on, this is a good example of how important the education discussion has become in the governor's race. Because over the last couple of decades, Northern Virginia, the suburbs outside of Washington, D.C., have become the most reliably Democratic part of the entire state. And now we're seeing more and more voters in that deep blue region of Virginia who are engaging on both sides of the education and curriculum debate. And so it ought to be a safe region for McAuliffe and his campaign have become a more contested one, once again, all because of this issue.
Thank you. What about the impact of the Progressive Caucus on the election and the perception?
What is the impact of the Progressive Caucus on the election?
Mhm.
Well, McAuliffe has been pretty careful. He's not, even though he himself is somewhat centrist, he's not criticizing the Democratic progressives. He's not criticizing Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez and the Progressive Caucus. What he's doing more generally is criticizing Democrats in Washington, Congress and the president for not being able to come to an agreement on Biden's legislative priorities. That implies some criticism of the progressives, but it spreads it around the more centrist Democrats as well. I think McAuliffe understands that if he were too forceful in his criticism of progressive Democratic leaders, it'd be even more difficult for him to motivate progressive Democratic voters to turn out on election day. So instead of criticizing one faction or the other, he's criticizing more broadly the process and the lack of progress being made. It allows him to distance himself from an increasingly unpopular president in Democratic Congress, but it doesn't necessarily put him to war with his own party's base.
Thank you. Sorry, got last one. Okay, I have begun not to trust political polling because I've not heard what question was asked regarding Biden. Why should we trust the polls when we do not know what questions were asked or other information gleaned from the participants?
Well, I guess a couple things. One, you can find out what questions are asked. In most mainstream news stories that cite public polling on Biden or on other topics, they will share the question that was asked. But what I'd say more broadly, and I think we've talked about this in past webinars as well, is when you look at public opinion polling, because different surveys from different sponsors phrase their questions in different ways, the smartest and most helpful way to look at public opinion polls is to compare them to themselves. So in other words, if the Washington Post does one poll and the New York Times does another and the Wall Street Journal does a third, don't compare them to each other, but rather compare this week's New York Times poll to the one that was taken a month ago and the poll that was taken the month before that. Compare the Washington Post poll that's out now to the one that was taken earlier this fall and over the summer and last spring, because different sponsoring organizations will tend to ask their question the same way in polling over time. And what that allows us to do is, rather than worrying about the absolute numbers, whether 48% of the people support one thing or 52% support the other, the most helpful way to read a public opinion poll is to look at the trending. And so if you look at polls taken over time by a particular organization, you can see, generally speaking, if those numbers are rising or going down. And what we've seen over the last several months is that in every major national public opinion poll, Biden's favorable ratings are lower than they were 2 months ago, 3 months ago, or 4 months ago. The nature of the question, and it's only natural, Democrats and Republicans both do this, is when faced with bad news, it's easy to blame the person who delivers the news. If you don't like the poll, say, well, maybe they didn't ask the question right. Now, if you look at the way the question was asked over time, even if you don't like the way it was asked, you can see trending. And what we can tell you now is that Biden does receive less favorable responses, regardless of the way the question was asked, than earlier this year. That's something his own advisors admit, and that's something that they will admit also readily and publicly need to be turned around before next year's midterm elections. Terry McAuliffe, the Democratic nominee for governor in Virginia, he said a few weeks ago that while he thought very highly of Joe Biden, they've been friends for several decades, that McAuliffe, thinks that Biden has been an added obstacle and an added challenge in this race. So again, I understand the temptation to dismiss a poll that brings a result different than the one that you might like. But if you look at the trending, you'll see that the Virginia governor's race is much closer now than it was a month ago, and that Biden's poll numbers, for better or worse, depending on where you sit on the political spectrum, are not as high as they were earlier this year.
To what extent might Harris's difficulties be contributing to Biden's lower polling?
I don't think very much. Vice presidents generally don't receive a great deal of attention from the voters. And although Harris has been given a couple of high-profile assignments by the president, most notably immigration, or the root sources of immigration, and in voting rights, since her trip down to Central America and Mexico earlier this year, she's not been particularly visible on either of those issues. Harris's favorable, unfavorable poll ratings are fairly similar to Biden's, so it doesn't appear that she's either helping him stay more popular than he would be otherwise or costing him popularity. It doesn't look like she's having a great deal of impact, at least on that question, one way or the other.
Thank you. On the concerns around economic inequality, can you explain Janet Yellen's proposal to tax unrealized capital gains? Why should you have to pay taxes on profits you never attained? I.e., you bought a stock at $1,000, it went up to $5,000, but then fell back to $1,000. Why should a person have to pay on that $4,000 jump when it was never realized?
So the argument, and many of the congressional Democrats are making this argument also because they're trying to find a way to pay for Biden's domestic policy priorities. The argument is that a working class individual pays taxes on the income they make whenever they receive their paycheck. A wealthier individual, one who's invests large amounts in the stock market, their worth increases, but they're not asked to pay taxes on the increases in the stock's value until they sell the stock. And the practical impact is that many people of financial means are able to either borrow against the increased value of their stocks, of their property, of their holdings, and therefore they're able to live off of those earnings, even though they're not paying taxes on them. The questioner is exactly right. If I buy a stock or a piece of property or a piece of artwork and it goes up in value, I technically haven't made any more money. But that does increase my financial leverage, and it allows me to borrow money from other sources and to live as if I had realized the earnings from those possessions the way I would once they were sold. It's not clear that these proposals to tax the increase in value before the holdings are sold is going to succeed. There's a huge counter push against this proposal, and it appears that the Democrats are looking for other ways to find that revenue. They're not talking about a tax on multimillionaires or even a tax on multi-billionaires that would only affect the top 10 or so income earners in the country, Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and a handful of others. So what Secretary Yellen and what many others are talking about is an attempt to achieve equity, saying that just because you make your money on stocks rather than by going to the workplace every day doesn't mean you shouldn't pay taxes on it. But it does get awfully complicated because we don't know precisely how much these holdings gain in value. And while nothing is definite, I'd be surprised if this ended up being part of the final tax package, just because it is so complicated.
Thank you. One final question before we wrap up. Can you comment on the judge giving pretrial release to one of the January 6 participants after he wrote a letter disavowing Trump? Some of these people have been held without charges for months.
Okay. I have to admit that while I have been following the legal proceedings relating to those involved in the January 6th riots, simply because I'm not a legal expert, I don't feel qualified to weigh in on the judge's decision. What is clear, though, is that Congress, the Congressional Oversight Committee looking into the January 6th riots, has been accelerating its efforts in a very noticeable way and talking to more and more of Trump's former advisors, both inside and outside the administration, issuing subpoenas, and it now looks like the Justice Department is going to weigh in as well to try to enforce those subpoenas. There's a race going on, and this is something that deserves a topic again for us in the future, Jessica, as well. The Democrats in Congress realize that if Republicans win back majorities in November, that will be the end of these investigations. So they're racing as fast as they can to conclude these investigations by November in case they don't maintain their majorities. Trump's allies understand the exact same dynamic and realize that if they can draw this out long enough, it doesn't guarantee a Republican majority in November, but if one should occur, it would mean that the investigation would not continue. So I apologize for avoiding the question about the rioters themselves. I just don't have informed knowledge on it. But the story I'd encourage you to watch on this front more than any other is the aggressiveness with which the Congressional Oversight Committee and the Justice Department works to attempt to get Trump's allies and advisors to testify in late 2021 or early 2022.
Awesome. Dan, well, thank you so much. And to our audience members, thanks for all of your wonderful questions. I hope that you guys have a great week, and we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday for our next session with Dan. So thank you so much. Kim, I'll turn this back over to you.
Thanks, Jessica. Kim, you're on mute. Okay, we're not. All right, so I'll thank everybody. As always, we're really grateful to you joining us. I really enjoy these webinars, and Kim and Jessica and Claire, I think you'd agree, do wonderful work. I hope you'd be willing to go to the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall website and make a small donation, because it's your donations that keep our team fed and housed. I think they do such terrific work for us that if you are willing to make even just a small contribution, it's something that all of us would be very grateful for. For those of you who are members of LA World Affairs Council Town Hall, we're grateful for your support and your insight and your participation. And for those of you who are able to be part of these discussions without having formally joined, we'd encourage you to at least consider becoming part of our organization. It's not all that expensive. Kim and her team put together a phenomenal set of programs, and I know you'd really benefit from being able to participate in them on an even more regular basis. We've got all sorts of neat programs coming up. You can go to our website at lawac.org, and I'll be back here again next Tuesday. We'll talk about Taiwan and China. We'll talk about the Glasgow Climate Summit, and maybe another topic as well. But keep an eye on the website and you'll find out for sure. Thanks so much to all of you for being with us tonight. Kim, you're back.
I am. I was unmuted, so thank you so much. And again, as Jessica said, please join us again next Tuesday for Dan's next Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. We also have tomorrow a conversation with U.S. Senator Todd Young of Indiana, who's on the Foreign Relations Committee, and he'll be focusing on competition with China. On November 1st, China's civilian army, the making of wolf warrior diplomacy. November 10th, Ambassador Nina Achigian, who is the Deputy Mayor of Los Angeles of the International Relations Department. So please go to our website, register today, and we hope to see you tomorrow. And of course, next Tuesday with Dan. Thanks, Dan, again. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.